Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
A core tenet of Christian belief is that Jesus was both human and divine. Many theologians like to amplify this idea by insisting that he was fully human and fully divine. I've never been able to wrap my brain around that idea, and I feel it needs to be said that that idea can't be found on the pages of the Bible. What about you, Scott? Did you ever choke on that idea of fully human and fully divine?
Well, for sure. And both ends of that question, like, what does it mean, fully divine? What does that mean? And fully human, what does that mean? And, I've struggled with those things since I came to faith, really. Yeah.
Okay. Many Christians are quite comfortable talking about the divinity of Christ. It's to his divinity that they might attribute his ability to do miracles in the first century Palestine, and it's with his divinity that they would say they engage with in their daily walk with him in the present. But the more one attaches divinity to Jesus, the more one creates a chasm between him and us. He becomes so unlike us. What do you think, Scott?
Oh, yeah, for sure. How do you identify? I mean, if he's just a God walking on the earth 10 feet above the ground, that doesn't do much for me. It doesn't help me in my struggles because I'm not a divinity walking 10 feet off the ground, right? I mean, I'd like to think so sometimes, but no. So probably I think one of the biggest attractions, if not the biggest, of Christian faith for myself and for anybody is it seems to present a God who really does engage with us, and who is transcendent, but gets down into the muck and the mire. And if you lose sight of Jesus' humanity, then you lose all that.
Today, we're not going to talk about divinity, or at least not till the last few minutes of the episode, if we still have time. Instead, we're going to focus most or all of this episode on the humanity of Jesus of Nazareth. And to do this, we're going to bring in an expert who essentially wrote the book on that subject. Dr. Daniel Kirk got his PhD in New Testament at Duke University. He has taught at a variety of institutions over a 10-year teaching career and is active in blogs and podcasts and is a frequently sought-out speaker. And he's written several books, including one that makes him the ideal guest for today's topic, a book with the title, A Man Attested by God, the Human Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels. His expertise in this area was also recognized by Zondervan Publishers when they published a Four Views book on the Christology of Mark's Gospel. A Four Views book is simply one in which an editor brings in four scholars coming from very different backgrounds and perspectives and asks them to compare and contrast their very different understanding of the topic at hand. So in this case, Dr. Kirk was their expert on the humanity of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. So, Dr. Kirk, Daniel, if I may, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, welcome. I've been reading your book, and it's quite a tome. It's quite a weighty piece of work, but I've been finding it fascinating, and it certainly raises a lot of questions in my mind that hopefully we'll touch on today. But it's a fabulous exploration. If anybody is, really interested in taking a deep dive on this subject.
Daniel, I found some very interesting talking points when I was doing my research on you. I learned through my sources that your backyard is overrun by chickens, that you brew your own beer that goes by the name The Cursing Reverend, and one of the job titles you held in the past was simply and ominously The Enforcer.
Oh my gosh. Who did you talk to?
That's how you're introduced by Patheos, where you blog, by... Oh, who does the brewed religions?
Homebrewed Christianity folks.
Yeah.
Homebrewed Christianity, right.
Uh-huh.
And Peter Enns, one of his introductions to you, The Enforcer.
All right. Interesting. Okay. That's some pretty deep history there. But yes, we are. We are living that yuppie dream with the backyard chickens and everything, and roasting my own coffee beans. The Cursing Reverend Roastery, the Cursing Reverend Brewery for the beer. It's
You should be on Vancouver Island with me. That's the vibe here. I didn't expect that from Dallas, Texas.
well, we moved to Dallas about 5 years ago. We were in San
Okay.
Francisco when
Oh,
all
there
of
you
this,
go.
took deep root. But yeah,
There you go.
please get me, find me a path to Vancouver Island. I'll walk it.
Okay, let's dive into this topic. And before we get too far into the weeds, gentlemen, I just want to emphasize why we're doing this episode. We're not trying to take anything away from the possible divinity of Christ. The listener is free to hang on to that idea, to do whatever they want with that idea. What we are trying to do, though, is to get the listeners to engage with the full humanity of Jesus of Nazareth. I know from personal experience, being raised for decades in a very fundamentalist Christian circles, that a lot of people will focus on his divinity and pay little or no attention to the fact that he was a human. And later in this episode, Daniel, you're going to tell us why that's a mistake, that there's a lot to be gained by understanding his full humanity.
Sure. And, I think just a great way to survey our theology. Like, I think for myself, growing up in a, traditional Southern Baptist church in the 80s, there used to be a thing called a moderate Southern Baptist in the US. Anyway, I think that growing up in Christianity, the only theological significance of Jesus' humanity was that it allowed him to die. So I think this is a good question for the listeners, just to kind of prime the pump. Like, not just do you believe that Jesus was human, but what does that do for you in your understanding of the Christian faith? And is there anything more than he had to be human so that he could die to, pay for our sins or something like that? And if not, I think that is reflective of a pretty wide-ranging deficiency in the teaching of the church, and not any particular church. I just think it's a pretty common shortcoming in our cultivation of our understanding of who Jesus is and why he matters.
In the very early church, there was a group that emphasized the deity to the detriment of Jesus' humanity at a pretty early stage, from my understanding. And so I've heard scholars say that for the early Christians, the challenge was not believing Jesus was God, but was believing that Jesus was human.
Hmm.
Is there any truth to that, or what do you think of that?
We definitely have evidence of people who were, I guess, what scholars have come to call Gnostic belief, that had such a denigration of the idea of the human body and flesh, and kind of really latching onto some of those ideas, that they really downplayed the true humanity of Jesus at all, and like that he just appeared to be human, or the true Christ kind of abandoned the human Jesus, at the crucifixion, or those kinds of things. So
Right.
we definitely have evidence of some folks really struggling to hold on to that there could be inherent goodness, value, importance in the humanity, other than whatever need there was for this death.
Right. Would that have been more true in the Hellenization of Christianity, or the Greek world, than in the Jewish context of the Synoptic writers?
For sure. For sure.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Daniel, in your book, you focused on the Synoptic Gospels, and they paint a very distinct picture of Jesus of Nazareth being fully human. They describe Mary going through what looked like a normal 9-month pregnancy and a normal delivery. No one said anything unusual about that, although, sure, yes, the conception was described as a bit unorthodox. They also tell us that Jesus was a normal baby that could get cold, so they had to wrap him up in swaddling cloths. They describe Jesus as getting hungry, needing to eat, needing to sleep, needing to walk everywhere he wanted to go. He didn't just float around like a ghost or suddenly appear in different places. He was also susceptible to pain, emotional and physical pain. At one point, he had to avoid the authorities or risk getting killed. And of course, we all know the authorities did eventually catch up on him and kill him. This all sounds very much like a normal human being.
Yeah, for sure. And again, the thing you start to realize is that, like, we take those things for granted, set them aside, then go looking for what really matters. because we've got this sense that that's not the stuff that matters, or like, okay, yeah. So when he comes to die, then there really is a human there to die. But part of my project is to really say that, like, in this larger biblical narrative, humanity has this really exceptional place to play as God's agents in the world, and Jesus comes to reclaim and restore that, like the fullness of our humanity. So yeah, those things are there, and I think the trick for us is to latch on to them, knowing, believing that they matter, and to explore them for what they tell us.
You mentioned that, and you've mentioned a few times, and of course in your book as well, the how much we miss by making that mistake, right? By
Hmm.
putting most of the emphasis on Jesus' divinity. It just reminds me, one of my favorite writers is the Russian writer Dostoevsky, and his conversion, really, if you call it a conversion, but his deepening of his faith came when he saw, I believe it was Grunewald's triptych of the crucifixion, and he saw Jesus' body on the cross, but he's all full of scars, and he's actually, the marks of death are there. And this so affected Dostoevsky because he thought it was the first time that he thought this was a man, this was a tortured
Hmm.
human being who actually died, and that wasn't really a big part of the Russian Orthodoxy of his youth. So it just reminds me of, like you're saying, how much we miss if we miss this important aspect.
Okay, Daniel, there's another line of evidence in the Gospels that clearly point at the humanity of Jesus that I think a lot of listeners, a lot of readers don't take notice of, maybe in part because they don't quite understand it. They don't appreciate the nuance of what this thing is. Everybody in the Gospel accounts seem to see Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. So, Daniel, I hope you'll indulge me reading from this rather long list, and then you can respond to anything in it.
All right.
So, before Jesus was even born, Mary, Joseph, Zechariah, the temple priest, and the wise men from the east all refer to the birth of this Messiah. At his birth, the shepherds were told he was the Messiah. Simeon labeled him the consolation of Israel, and the prophetess Anna said the baby would bring the redemption of Jerusalem. Again, I'm just hearing Jewish Messiah. During his ministry, Jesus himself said he came only to the lost sheep of Israel and wanted to turn the nation of Israel back to Yahweh. Again, Jewish Messiah. And then there's his audience during his public ministry. John the Baptist, Andrew, Philip, the Samaritan woman, Peter, the apostle at the triumphal entry, one of the two thieves on the cross, the Roman soldiers, and even unclean spirits, all specifically referred to him as the Jewish Messiah, aka the King of the Jews, the Chosen One, and the Christ. Even after the crucifixion, his followers asked, "Is this when you restore the kingdom to Israel?" Something that a Jewish Messiah was expected to do. And the book of Acts records many sermons given by the disciples and apostles, always using lots of messianic language. And the writer of Acts often summarizes their speeches by simply saying how they showed how he was the Messiah. Dr. Kirk, can you tell us what this title, Jewish Messiah, meant to them and what it says to us about the humanity of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think this is a really important thing to recognize. There's all kinds of, when you start digging into the Gospels, there are all kinds of titles, descriptions, echoes of, you've got a new Moses figure, all these different ways that Jesus embodies Israel's story and fulfills that story. And I think part of our being able to appreciate the significance of Jesus, like setting aside the divinity and saying, no, these things matter, is to really to get a rich understanding of what the Jewish people expected from the Messiah, what God's promises were for this person who would come. And, there's a lot of things that are surprising about Jesus that are not exactly anticipated in Hebrew Bible and Jewish scriptures and expectations, like being crucified. But the idea of the Messiah is simply, like, most generally, it's a royal figure and somebody who fulfills God's promise to David that David would always have a descendant sitting on the throne. And this figure's job was to rule God's people on God's behalf. And like for me, I can't talk about this without mixing the language of Genesis 1 with God's purpose for David and his descendants, because David really is, in the way that he gets idealized in the Hebrew Bible, he is the reiteration of God's primal expectation for humanity, which is these people are going to rule the world on God's behalf. Like that's what God creates humanity to do. And when God creates humans, he creates them. We hear the language that God makes them in a God's image and likeness. And if you go a few chapters up, you find out Adam had a son in his image and likeness, Seth. So image and likeness language is sonship language. It's the image of children. So God created humans to be God's children who would rule the world on God's behalf. So then when you start looking at the theology around the Davidic kings, and you get enthronement language where God says to the king, "You are my son; today I've begotten you." Right? It's this reiteration of Genesis 1, where God is like forming a child for the purpose of being God's stand-in to faithfully rule the world on God's behalf. So like that's some of like the big picture theology for me for this messianic expectation. And what this king was going to do, there was a lot of expectation that they're going to come and really reestablish in Israel the reign of God over God's people, and from there establish the reign of God's people over the nations of the earth. And that's where things get really surprising. And maybe why, like if you read Mark seems to be a little hesitant about the title Messiah. Not that it's wrong, but that it takes the whole ministry of Jesus through the death and resurrection to give you the definition of what Messiah means in this particular case. But to say all that is to say there was a human King David who was going to have a human descendant who God was going to empower in a special way to be God's ruler over the world. And this, like if you read those Davidic stories, like the echoes with Jesus can get really fun and interesting. Like, there was this whole conflict over who actually possesses the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God had fallen on Saul when he was anointed, but then Saul kind of got possessed by this evil spirit, and David would play and like calm him. But when basically God says, like when David's anointed, he says, "I have taken my spirit from you and placed it on my servant David." So the idea that the Messiah is in the line of David, he's a Davidic king, he's empowered by the Spirit of God, and his job is to faithfully rule over the people of God on God's behalf. Like some basic Jewish theology is, we're going to have this human king. He's going to come to us in the name of God. He's going to rule us faithfully so that we can live faithfully, because that's part of it too. You've got to have, it's kind of like this, almost this trickle down thing where you've got to have a good, faithful ruler in order that the people can act in a way that will also be pleasing to God. So you get this whole restoration and renewal of the people of Israel under God's faithful king, basically to please God by us being the people that God had always intended for humanity to be. So the one thing I'm probably downplaying a little bit is the geopolitical. I think most messianic expectation was Jesus is going to come and kill the Romans, and this is how it's going to happen. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. Actually, I think that's a really good reading of the prophets. I think the fact that the Maccabean revolt had been so successful in the intertestamental period, I think that probably helped create a lot of expectation around a messianic age where the Romans could be defeated just like the Greeks had been. So that's like the big surprise. But the most important thing I think for our conversation is there is this whole rich expectation of a a Messiah figure that has nothing to do with pre-existence or, some like God becoming incarnate in order to do the work. Like sometimes we'll talk about, oh, there's Jesus and then there's the cosmic Christ. I hear people using that. And I feel like that's such misleading language because Christ is just the Greek version of the Jewish word Messiah, which just means descendant of David, who is going to be the one who rules the world on God's behalf.
I really like the parallels you're drawing there with Saul and David and so on. And it makes me think that the importance of John's baptism, because it's there that we see the Spirit falling on Christ and God pronouncing him as his son, right? It sounds
Yeah.
to me like that's a very similar thing to what happened with David, right? Where God says he's taken the Spirit from Saul, and now he's saying that David is his son, right? So is that a fair parallel?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think that is Jesus. Like what the anointing with oil is a symbol of is the anointing of the Spirit that comes on God's people, on the king or the prophet or whoever, so that they can faithfully represent God. So the baptism is this really critical moment where, again, it's not a revelation of who Jesus always was so much as like his adoption to this role, his appointment to this role of Son of God, which means Christ and one who's going to rule on God's behalf. And there's all kinds of interesting things like as you move forward in the history of the church, like from we get the earliest letters, then we've got some gospel writings and then some later writings. As you move forward from that, like through that, the time when Jesus becomes Son of God gets pushed farther back into his timeline. So in Paul, Romans 1:4, Jesus is appointed Son of God with power by the Spirit at the resurrection from the dead. So for Paul, when Jesus, by the power of the Spirit, is made Lord over all things at the resurrection, that's his enthronement as Son of God and Lord in Christ. And that's not to say that Paul doesn't imagine Jesus being Son of God in other sorts of ways, like with the crucifixion and everything. But when you come back to Mark's gospel, which doesn't have a birth narrative, it's the baptism that's that point of you are my son, and that also has important echoes at the transfiguration and the crucifixion, where after Jesus gets expires and the Spirit goes away from him, the centurion says, "Surely this man was Son of God." So it's interesting. Like, is he Son of God while he possesses the Spirit, has the anointing, is playing this role? And then when you get to John's Gospel, which is the latest, then you have a Son of God that's pushed back into prehistory. And actually, when you get to Matthew and Luke, they have it at the birth that he's going to be conceived by the Holy Spirit, and therefore the one is in you will be called Son of the Most High. So that's Luke. When you get your birth narratives, then Son of God is associated with, again, the Spirit, but the Spirit at conception. And then John pushes, who's the latest gospel, pushes it back into like this pre-existent sonship with God before Jesus comes down. So just to say, like, that's just a quick rundown of like 3 or 4 different theologies of the sonship of Jesus being Son of God, 3 or 4 of which are only about what happens to Jesus as a human, like through being raised from the dead, at his baptism, being conceived and born, and then only one of which, the John's gospel, pushes us outside of the space time that Jesus lived in as a man. So, this is, and Son of God is one of those places where we immediately jump to divine categories, forgetting that we're sons and daughters of God too. We always are so quick to go to that other category. So you brought up the baptism, and it just got me preaching a little bit. But it's you rightfully point out that it's a picture of the royalty of Jesus, and his royal anointing as Messiah is really at the heart of the Son of God language as we find it, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Well, it's interesting that even in John's gospel, with that, that philosophical kind of metaphysical opening, but even there, he immediately brings us back to earth and says, there was a man in the wilderness, this guy John, and he goes to the baptism. So it's almost like,
Mhm.
that there's a sense that he's giving us this kind of metaphysical foundation, but then he's saying, but the way this is realized is that,
Mhm.
this man named John recognized Christ. And I've also wondered, I don't know your thoughts on this, but I've also wondered, do you think there was a more significant movement of John's disciples that we maybe give credit? Like, in other words, that the gospel writers want to emphasize that it's Jesus, not John.
Right.
You think there's some echoes there of that?
Yes. I mean, I think getting into the details might take us pretty far afield, but yes, I
Right.
do
Okay.
think that there was probably, I think we see, if you kind of mirror read, just like what's behind, why is John so defensive about Jesus being better than him in this case? Like, who needs to hear that? And like, why is that here? I think there's a good case to be made that there was a persistent community of John the Baptist followers that didn't take the handoff from John to Jesus immediately.
Right. Well, then you have the Samaritan case, the in Acts where
Oh, right.
where they're told to go witness the Spirit falling on the again. I think as a like the inclusiveness of the gospel to say to them that this is for everybody kind of thing, and including John's disciples.
Mhm.
I can imagine just from knowing human tendencies that there was probably a significant movement of people questioning whether John was the one or whether it's Jesus, and we hear the echoes of that in the writings.
Yep. Yep. I think so.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Daniel, I'd like to take you back to what you were saying a few minutes ago. You were talking a lot about Son of God, and earlier you were talking about Son of David. Can you unpack for us why Jesus always referred to himself as the Son of Man and never as the Son
Mm.
of God? And there's even that one case in Luke 22 where he specifically asks, "Are you the Son of God?" And his answer is, "You say that I am." And then he
Mm.
Mhm.
follows it up with this. He says, "You say that I am the Son of God, and you will see the Son of Man lifted up." So he completely deflects the label that was put on him and he replaces it with the one he seems to always
Mm.
prefer, the Son of Man. So can you tell us what's the difference between these two titles?
Yeah,
Mhm.
this is a great question. I mean, the Son of Man question is it's so fraught. So several things. First of all, I mentioned earlier that Jesus is doing a lot of reinterpretation, and like there are things about who Jesus is as Messiah that are a really big surprise, like the cross. Like if you're dead, you're not the Messiah. Okay, like that's just kind of basic stuff. And so I think one reason why Jesus goes to Son of Man so often is in part because it was not a fixed title in early Judaism with a set of fixed expectations around it in the same way that Messiah or even Son of God would have been. So that's speculative, but what you see happening, and so okay, so I'm going to use Mark's gospel because it's earliest and it's super clear here. So in Mark's gospel, the gospel falls very neatly in half. And the point where it falls in neatly in half is stuff that happens before the confession of Peter and the stuff that happens after the confession of Peter in chapter 8. Okay, so the first 8 chapters, almost every miracle that you know of that Jesus did, that's where they are. He feeding 5,000, feeding 4,000, guy with a who gets lowered by his friends, casting out demons from demoniac, all this stuff. Okay, that's all in 1 through 8. Then there's Peter's confession, and then Peter's rejection of the confession, and then after that, chapter 8, he's in Caesarea Philippi, which is as far from Jerusalem as he ever gets. And then there's that time where he predicts his death. Chapter 9, they're on the road to Jerusalem and he predicts his death and the disciples fight about who's the greatest. Chapter 10 is triumphal entry where Jesus predicts his death a third time, and then you're into the last week of his life. So from chapter 8, so like chapters like 1 through 8 through the confession is all the acts of power and the feeding narratives and all that. And then after the confession of Peter, everything is about heading toward Jerusalem and the death. And you get it all like comes together right there around this dispute that Jesus and Peter have, where so Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Well, you're John the Baptist or whoever. Really interesting ideas. And then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ. And so Jesus in Mark doesn't say good job. And Jesus says, shut up, don't tell anyone. And then he
Right.
says, the Son of Man. So he takes this new title that he's been using of himself, is going to have to be rejected, suffer, and die. And then Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. Okay, so what's happened? Well, Jesus has used the Son of Man title like 3 times already in Mark's gospel. And every time it has to do with a claim to authority. I'm going to show you that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Now rise up, take up your mat, and go home. Or in the grain fields, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So, like, it's concomitant with this power, this authority that Jesus has. And so, like that fits, right? Like, okay, we've got the power Messiah, which we love, and that fits this Christ title really well. So Peter, when he's asked and say, "Oh yeah, like power Christ, power Messiah, that's the Christ, that's who you are." But then as soon as Jesus says, yeah, I'm going to suffer and die, Peter says, no. Then Jesus says, he doesn't say I, actually, he said the Son of Man is going to be rejected, suffer and die, and then rise again on the third day. And then they have this little fight, and Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And it's not a great moment. And
Yeah.
then he says, whoever's going to come be my disciple must take up their cross and follow me. So Son of Man is a title that Jesus can use. Like the first way he uses it is authority and power, and he only uses it like that, like in referring to himself and who he is here on earth in the first 8 chapters. Then in each of his predictions of his death, he uses Son of Man. But this is now in chapter 8, 9, and 10, when the story is heading toward Jerusalem. And then he has this moment where he predicts that the Son of Man is going to come on the clouds of heaven. And that's going to be sort of his ultimate vindication of, when he's talked about that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and not one stone's going to be left another. And then, at the end, you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. So there's this future aspect, this glorification aspect. This is all going to hold together, but that last one is the place that lets us know that Daniel 7 is the background for all of this Son of Man language. Okay, that's at least in the gospel story. That's where it's rooted from. So Daniel 7 is a vision that the prophet has, and in the vision, there's these 4 monstrous beasts that rise up. One of them, actually, the first one, he rises up on 2 feet like a human being and is given power to rule. Like the echoes of Genesis 1. Like, what's horrific about Daniel 7 is that the beasts are doing what humans should do. So you've got these nasty beasts, and they're destructive, and they're destroying each other. And what is the setting to rights of that scene in the vision? This is all vision stuff. Is God takes God's throne, and then one who's like a human being comes in, and God gives this human being rule and power and authority over all creation. So Daniel 7, in the level of the vision, it's an anti-creation to new creation vision, where animals at first rise up and displace humans as rulers, and then God takes one like a human being and makes him ruler over all things. So that's the one like the Son of Man. It's the one who comes into the presence of God and is given by God authority to rule over all the nations. And so first, as we think back on Daniel 7, there's like from the level at that level, it's just, that's kind of confirmatory that like this is somebody who's playing a very similar role to a Davidic king. Okay. So you've got somebody who's not God, who is given a throne next to God to literally be God's right-hand man and rule the world over on God's behalf. Now, In Daniel 7, there's also an interpretation of the vision. He's like, what is this that's going on? And so an angel is like, okay, well, this is what's going on. So the beasts are kings. That's who they really are, these kings that are rising up. And they're giving power over the holy ones of the Most High, God's people. They're given power over God's people for a time, times and half a time. And then God's going to take God's throne. And what is the answer to like what the Son of Man thing is? It's God giving authority not to God's self or to God's eternal Son, but to the saints, to the holy ones of the Most High. It's establishing the people of God, those humans who had previously been killed, as the ones who get to rule the world on God's behalf, who get to play that role. And so with that, with like from persecution under the hands of these kings to exaltation by God, that gives us a little bit more understanding of how this Son of Man thing helps hold together Jesus' ministry, because it's not just about somebody given power. It's about somebody who suffers and is killed by these kings who are ruling over God's people, and then has their fortunes reversed and rules the world over on God's behalf. And actually, the end of Daniel, like in Daniel 12, is where you get one of the very few Old Testament passages, maybe some people say the only one, that actually talks about resurrection of the dead. And what happens is, like, people, including the prophet, who have been killed, God raises them up to shine brightly and like to play this role of those who are like ruling for God over this world. So when we come to the Synoptic Gospels and Jesus is using this term, Son of Man, about himself, first of all, at the level of just what do words mean? Son of Man means human being, the human being. And it has this resonance with Daniel, in which there is the human being is given this, you see him in this cosmic vision, but he represents human beings, that the human beings who are the people of God. Incidentally, in between Daniel and the time the Gospels were written, there was a book written called First Enoch, and First Enoch is this vision of the heavenly realms, and there is a figure called the Son of Man who rules the world for God, judges the world for God, and all this. And there's been some really good research done into this document, but one of the things that I didn't know, because I don't read Ethiopic, and the only preserved version is Ethiopic, is people have argued that this Son of Man figure in Enoch is actually like an angel, like this pre-existent angel figure, and that, but they use the Son of Man title just based on like kind of the cosmic imagery. But actually, in the Ethiopic, they don't use the same word Son of Man every time. They use about 4 or 5 different phrases that are different ways of saying this is a human being, like the son of the mother of the living, the son of Eve, the son of Adam, the son of the humanity. So there's like 4 different ways, but I mean, the point is a human being. And at the very end, it's like, oh, by the way, this is Enoch. This is you who's filling this role. So it was actually a human being who is a prophet who got snatched up to heaven, who then like did all of this, but as a human being. So in any way that there's resonance with other like things that Jewish people already had in their heads about Son of Man, it's humans who rule the world for God, maybe who end up having this exalted human status, but it lets Jesus play with the different resonances of that and basically he's creating his own messianic title with the content of his own ministry. What does it mean that he's Son of Man? He's the human being who has authority on earth to forgive sins. He's the human being who has authority to say what is and what isn't Sabbath breaking. What does it mean that it's Son of Man? It means that he is going to rule over the powers of the earth, but only after he has succumbed to their power for a while. So, I think that for our conversation, most important thing is to say, Son of Man means human being. And what Jesus does as Son of Man, he's saying, I am the human one. I'm the man. I'm the man. Um, Interestingly, he also entrusts all of those things or calls his disciples to all of those things that he does as Son of Man. He's in the first half of the book where he's feeding, he's healing, he's embodying this ministry of power. He sends his disciples to do all of those things. And then when he says, I'm the Son of Man's going to have to die, like this single most unrepeatable thing that Jesus does for us, the next thing he does is say, anybody who wants to be my disciple has to deny themselves, take up your cross and follow me. And there's echoes elsewhere, not so much in Mark, a little bit more in Matthew and Luke, of the idea of like those who have followed Jesus to the point of death, like sitting on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That idea of sitting enthroned in the heavenly court, it's not just for Jesus, it's for Jesus' followers in these stories as well. And so that's part of, to me, the beauty of allowing the humanity to be the humanity allows us to start connecting the dots a little bit more as well, so that we recognize that these aren't just stories about Jesus. They're supposed to be stories that are involving of Jesus' followers, showing them what it looks like for them to be fully and faithfully human, even as Jesus was, and living lives that embody that same sort of fulfilled humanity with all its echoes of David and Adam thrown in there as well.
Do you think Jesus' reluctance to use a messianic title, Christ, is partly because it would have sparked a revolution too soon? Because he becomes much more direct in the very final hours, right? But up to that point, it's like, don't tell anybody this, don't. And I wonder if, just in a practical sense, he didn't want that getting out there too soon, that he was claiming to actually be Israel's Messiah, because of what that would have caused. You think that's a valid point, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it would have caused and the expectations that never were realized. I mean, even after the crucifixion and resurrection, the disciples are like, okay, so is now the revolution? Is now the time that you're gonna restore the kingdom to Israel? And I do think that the biggest surprise is the non-political definition of the kingdom of God as Jesus in the early church ended up embodying and practiced it.
So, Daniel, at this point in our conversation, I want to pull together these two threads that we've been unraveling, the physical limitations of a very human Jesus and the full humanity of a Jewish Messiah. As a human, a normal human being, Jesus didn't know everything. And I don't think anyone's going to argue, convincingly at least, that Jesus knew everything when he was just a kid. There is a verse in the Gospel of Luke where it says that he grew in wisdom. And that verse is part of a story that I've often heard used to make some pretty big claims about how much Jesus knew when he was just a kid. The story of him as a 12-year-old in the temple during Passover. Most people have heard of this story. If you don't know it, then pause the podcast and check it out in Luke chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. And here's my point that I'd like to hear the two of you talk about. The Gospel of Luke doesn't say he was teaching the temple priests. This is what I had long been led to believe. This is how many modern Christians like to tell the story. But it doesn't say he was teaching them. The Gospel writer says Jesus was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So I have this image in my head of a 12-year-old, a precocious little kid, who has this fascination about, say, quantum physics, or how does a fighter jet engine work? And she's asking questions and making connections in her head how these things fit together to make a fighter jet engine work. And when the teacher or parent asks her a question to gauge the depth of her understanding, they're just gobsmacked. Hear the things coming from her mouth and how she's putting it all together in her head. So I see that image and I project that onto this story. This story isn't telling us that the boy Jesus had an encyclopedic understanding of Jewish theology. I could suggest that Jesus might have been just simply asking questions about this Jewish Messiah thing he kept hearing about. All the people in the synagogues were talking about it, and maybe his mother and his relatives making comments about him being this chosen one. And I wonder if this is where he begins to see his destiny a little bit more clearly. Daniel.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I could see where, if not his ultimate destiny, at least, a recognition of his uh that he might have a place among the leaders of his people, with his just the way that everything fits and makes sense to him, and the kinds of questions that he asks, and they sounds like encouragement that he was getting from the temple priests. Like, yeah, these are my people, this is my people, and maybe God's given me something special to give back to
Mm.
them.
And it's unusual for a child, to do that, to ask the kind of, those kinds of questions. It must have been, I can see where that would be quite amazing, but usually kids at that age are not engaging in those kinds of conversations and so on. So that in itself would be, I would think, would be quite a shock.
Right. Yeah, the best questions always come from the 4, 5, and 6 year olds who don't realize they're
Yeah.
not supposed to be asking those questions anymore.
Yeah.
And then you get a
Yeah.
pause until about, if you're lucky, 18 or 20, and then
Yeah. That's true.
Okay. I don't know whether to push on that. If we had more time, I think I would, but we are,
Okay.
it's getting short. So further on this idea, this claim, this point I'm trying to make that Jesus didn't know everything, let's look at
hmm
his ministry, his public ministry when he was 30 years old. Even then, there's lots of examples of Jesus asking questions. And
Mm.
sure, sometimes the questions are just rhetorical. It's a way to teach, a question asked in order to make a point. For example, when he says, what's easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to get up and walk? If you know the story, you know the point he's making there. But there are other times where it looks like he's asking questions because he doesn't know the answer. Like asking, where did they bury the dead Lazarus? Which,
hmm
by the way, the news of Lazarus' death seemed to take him quite by surprise. Asking who touched his robe in order to get their healing. Asking people, what do you want me to do for you? Asking the blind man, how well can you see now? Before he finds out
Mm.
that he needs to put another handful of mud in the guy's eye. Asking the disciples how many loaves they had. And, of course, there's that one verse that always tripped me up back in my naive Pentecostal rapture-focused days when Jesus is asked, when will the apocalypse come? And Jesus says, no one knows, only the Father. So, Daniel, Jesus clearly
Yeah.
didn't know everything.
He didn't. And this is one of those, you just rattled off a whole litany of reasons why, like, so my reading of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is that they wrote their story without any sense of Jesus' divinity. So like they're not writing against it. Not like, oh, there are some people who thought Jesus was God and they're writing these stories to show they're wrong. But I don't think that was part of their Christology at that point. And these sorts of things are the sorts of things that are problems only if you have a theology of Jesus that says he's God already. And then these passages become problematic. Or, so like, to me, the most obvious one, this is just a little bit different, but like when you get to the crucifixion and the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like, it's so it makes complete sense within the story world where Jesus is this man whom God has anointed with the Spirit to play this role as, King of Israel, and to be forsaken as Israel's king. It's not necessarily like a big metaphysical claim like, oh, the Spirit's gone from me, or God's turned God's back on me in heaven. You're dying on the cross, and God didn't save you from that. That's being abandoned by God. Just that very act of being given over to death, which is a language that Scripture uses, that God, handing over Jesus to death. That's forsaking. So that I feel like it goes with those other things you said as part of this larger category of things that make complete sense of a human, specially empowered by God, full of the wisdom of God, knowing the will of God, empowered over the creation to rule the world on God's behalf in a way that is surprising and miraculous because God has empowered him to that extent, and yet who is also a human who didn't
Mm.
know germ theory, who couldn't have just told us, like, if we wash our hands, millions of lives will be saved, between before the Van Leeuwenhoek comes around with his microscope.
Right, right,
And that he was very much a man of his time, and with limitations of a human, like not knowing, like, he felt the power go out of him. That was wild, but he didn't know who did it. And there were other things like that where he's not carrying around God's omniscience.
right. And look at the garden narrative where he sweats blood and is asking God if there's any other way. Like,
Right.
in a sense, saying, like, I don't want to do this. And you know what I mean? I'll obey, but man, if there's any other way, like that, it's a very human moment, I think. And
Hmm.
it just underscores exactly what you're saying. One of my favorite songs is, I think it's, Osborne is her last name, but what if God was one of us? I
Uh-huh.
love that song. She gets theology better than most theologians. It would, what if God was one of us, just a stranger on the bus trying to make his way home? And when I read the Gospels, I often think, yeah, that's Jesus. He's trying to make his way home, and a lot of times I think that he struggles. He doesn't really understand, but he always submits his will. That's the key, right? That
Hmm.
the victory of the garden is not my will, but thine, which is exactly the opposite of what we all do every day. It's kind of my will instead of yours, right?
Mm.
So yeah, it's beautiful stuff.
Just to belabor my point, what you're saying is
Yep.
exactly what I'm trying to get at. It's just that when it was actually articulated as bluntly as this, it smacked me in the face. This was about 10 years ago when I was taking courses at the MacDiv College. And the professor asked the question about who is this Jesus? What do we really know about him? And the way he phrased the question really struck me. And so the question that I'm posing to you now is, as Jesus is walking through life for 30 years or 33, whatever it was, is it possible that from the time he was this 12-year-old kid in the temple asking questions to this point when he's 30 or something years old hanging on the cross, he's only gradually putting together the complete picture of his mission and his
Mm.
purpose?
Mm. Could be. Yes. And I think the maybe some of the clearest indications we get of that are, like, early on, his first day, he goes and does cool things and heals people at Simon's mother-in-law's house. And then he goes out to pray by himself. And then when the disciples catch up with him, he's like, "Oh, we got to go someplace else because that's why I'm here." Like, the idea that he is trusting in God, like, moment to moment, to know what's going to be next. And yeah, I think I wouldn't say that I have a sense of, like, did he know that he was heading for the cross, like, through Mark 1 through 8? Like, I don't know that we get any indications in the story that, this is where it's starting to dawn on Jesus. But yeah, I would say there we get one or two hints which are probably representative rather than exhaustive, that Jesus is learning as he goes exactly what his mission is going to look like. And part of that is because he's also responding to the people who are around him and what they're doing and not doing, and having to respond to that, that how long am I going to have to put up with you people question, like, he's actively responding to what people understand and don't understand, as well as probably responding to his own understanding of what God's will is for him.
Why do some people today get really uncomfortable? And I'm thinking especially, quite frankly, evangelicals and fundamentalists get quite uncomfortable when we emphasize the humanity of Jesus. What's at stake? Why do they get so uncomfortable with that? And then secondly, you wrote in your book that the fact that this new perspective was very liberating for you. So how is this greater awareness of Jesus' humanity helpful in our practice, in our faith?
Hmm. I think that the reason why it makes people uncomfortable, And, I can't read other people's minds, but reflecting on myself and my own journey, we as Christians carry around a pretty profound sense cultivated over hundreds, if not thousands of years, that at the heart of Christianity is thinking the right things.
Mm.
And we define our tribes by the things that we think that are right, that other people think that are wrong. So whether it's I'm Protestant versus Catholic because I think the right thing about justification by faith and the relationship between grace and works. Or we're going to push it back farther and say, I'm a faithful Christian because I believe in the Trinity and that Jesus is fully God and fully man. So when you start the divinity being something that has been contested in the past, where people are like,
Mm.
no, Arius, we don't want the ghost of Arius walking around here. It's part of our identity as Christians to say the right things about the matters that have defined us as being right, which makes us faithful and actually Christian, unlike those other people. So if you peel back the layers of the onion, why does it make us cringe when someone's like, we're going to just leave the divinity aside here for a minute and we're going to talk about why the humanity matters? Is they think that we're trying to make them Arians, or get them onto the wrong side of what the church has decided is true. So I think that's a considerable part of it, and part of a larger framework of thinking the right things, that you believing the right things, being what makes us the faithful people of God. Um, this thing that I think was liberating for me about this is that first of all, it makes the gospel stories matter. Like, like honestly, in the theology I grew up with, I I did not need Mark 1 through 15. I didn't need Matthew 1 through 26. I didn't need Luke 1 through 22. I just needed the last two chapters where he's dying. And so part of it was, okay, because the story of this person matters, and because it matters in the way that Jesus lived his life and like made it matter, I now have these stories that are actually significant for for faith. Also, then you start to realize that uh, it's really easy in Protestant Christianity, especially where we're really keen that it's by grace and Jesus does this for me, that we lose track not only of imitation and obedience of Christ, but even the stuff in Paul, like union with Christ and being, joined with him in his life, death, and resurrection. But once you've said this is about Jesus as a human, all of a sudden being human isn't a problem to be fixed. It's something magnificent to be redeemed, restored, embraced. Our own identity as humans stops being something to apologize for. Like, I blame Anselm for this. Anselm, why did God become human? Well, why the God man? Well, it has to be God because of the infinite worth and value of God. And, it has to be human because we have this huge debt that we owe to God because of our dishonoring him through all the things we've done. And so only God has the infinite well of honor to be able to restore what went wrong. In other words, God because cool and infinite, human because we suck, right? And he has to suck like us in order to marry the infinite riches of God, in order to get us out of our hole. But if you start from a creation perspective rather than a fall perspective, then human, because if Jesus is not fully human, then God's purposes for the world have been thwarted by the power of evil and sin and disobedience. It's only by being fully human that God's original intention to have image-bearing human creatures ruling the world faithfully on God's behalf can be realized and restored. It's only by Jesus being fully human that God is actually triumphant in the end over all of the missteps and mistakes that have marred humanity from the beginning. So it is a restoration and ultimately an affirmation of God's creation project for new creation to come about through a fully human Jesus, that show that it is actually possible to be this kind of person that would please God, empowered by the Spirit, following Jesus, walking in this way. So I find that to be exciting. I find it to be liberating. I find it to give shape to what a Christian life should look like. How do we judge whether we're living a life that's faithful and pleasing to God? I think all of those things are pretty profoundly impacted by not just acknowledging this humanity, but realizing that it's at the core of Jesus' identity, mission, and all of these things that he does.
Mhm. Wow, just an excellent summary. And as you were talking, I'm thinking of the whole parallel that Paul draws between Christ being the second Adam, right? The
Right.
second man, right? He's the righteous man who makes the righteous choices. So, in the desert, I always think of the contrast of the garden and the desert. That the first Adam, he has a good, but he disobeys. Jesus goes out into a desert under extreme conditions and he obeys. So he's the righteous man, and he's not floating 5 feet off the ground. I mean, that just would ruin the whole message to me of the New Testament if you see Jesus as kind of, floating 10 feet off the ground. I mean, then God's rigging things. Like it's not real, it's rigged.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's really important that Jesus has to do these things as a human being, just like us, as is said a number of times in the New Testament. But we slip into a kind of a form of Gnosticism so easily in the Christian world, especially in the evangelical world. And I think you're right too that we have to remember the background too of the 19th century, where liberal theology came to the fore and denied the divinity of Christ for the most part, and so this began a big battle, right? And so the evangelicals, and not just the evangelicals, but other Protestants, have been fighting this battle of the divinity of Christ, and that has led to a big imbalance.
Yep.
Yeah.
Daniel, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to have covered, or would you like to summarize, give a final statement of some kind?
Wow. I mean, I feel like we've done some good coverage here. I mean, we've talked about Son of God, we've talked about Son of Man, and I think something that I hope your listeners have picked up on is that part of my passion in all this is that we make choices about how we read the Bible, even if we don't realize we're doing it. And one of the choices that I make is holding together this whole story from creation through the story of Israel, through the human Jesus, into the new creation that Paul talks about, that I think is roughly equivalent to the kingdom of God that Jesus talks about. And yeah, I would just invite people to explore that and to in thinking about Jesus and his identity, to not get so trapped in reading Jesus through what came after the New Testament that we miss the riches that are there to be mined if we understand his story as the culmination of what's come before.
Mm.
Thank you so much. And Daniel, you've got 4 good, solid books in your bibliography, in your under your belt. Is there more coming down the pipeline?
Not that I know of. Well, okay, I want to say a couple things. First of all, if you want to explore this stuff, it's not exactly what this book was about, but I wrote a book called Jesus Have I Loved But Paul? And it's a very accessible book, and it plays with this new creation theology. It talks about Son of Man as like second Adam, like that interaction, and goes through some ethics and things. So if you want a starter, that'll be a lot easier to get through than 600 pages of nerd talk in a Man Attested by God. Buy them both, please, for my publishers, for my children's college funds. But so I'll say that. Otherwise, one of my liabilities at this point is I've changed careers and I'm in healthcare now. So this means that I've given up some of my platforms, which means the publishers don't want to publish my books anymore. So, there are things that are cooking, and if you just keep your eyes open around the interwebs, maybe I'll appear in due course. But if you're interested in my work on Paul, I also wrote a book called Unlocking Romans. And then I wrote a little commentary on Romans in the Pete Enns Bible for Normal People Empire. It's called Romans for Normal People. So if that stuff is interesting to you, that's out there as well.
May
Absolutely.
I ask why the change in careers? It seems like a loss for the theological world, but what's or is that too big a question?
Theological world didn't want me. So, I think I've always been somebody whose theology and views have been developing. And, I got to a point when I was at Fuller Seminary where, in part because of my changing views on sexuality, and in part because they didn't like this book I was writing, and other things, that I didn't end up getting tenure. And then it was kind of a tricky time to try to find a place in higher ed, especially someone who's moving between worlds in terms of theological location. So it didn't seem like there was a career path for me there anymore. And so I thought, well, there's other careers that actually pay you enough money to live in whatever city you're living and that have vibrant job markets. That would be kind of nice. So that is my reality currently. I also, honestly, I work shift work, so I've got plenty of time. So, I do sit down every now and then and hammer some things out on the computer. It's just figuring out the right venues for those. I have the energy for writing things. I don't have the energy for building a platform again. That just sounds exhausting. So anyway, we'll see what happens. If anybody out there wants to be my minion and help me build a platform, drop me an email.
It's interesting too that Fuller, because Fuller is considered by the evangelical world as very much to the left, right? Like probably the most liberal, using the term carefully, of within that world, right? So it's just interesting to me that they took such offense or whatever. I noticed in your book, you're at pains to say, I'm not knocking the divinity of Christ here. This isn't a screed knocking the divinity of Christ. This is only to say that there's this other half that we're missing. But I guess that didn't cut it for them. And that plus the LGBTQ thing, that seems to be interesting.
I lament. And I understand it. I respect your decision 100%, but I just think it's a loss. There's who is it? I think it was Gandhi who said, "Christ I like, but it's the Christians. It's your church I don't like." And I have to say, from personal experience, I still want to embrace Christianity, but I'm getting so fed up with so much that's going on in Christianity. So anyhow, we've kept you too long. I apologize.
No, I very much enjoyed this conversation, and have I lost my heart for it? I don't know, but you guys got me preaching at least 4 times in the last hour. So it was a good conversation. I really appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye now. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. Or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.